It's said that a man's house is his castle. We moderns view our homes as private refuges from which we can escape and shut out the world. In the Roman Republic, on the other hand, the house of an aristocrat was home not just to his family, but to a number of slaves, and it was also a place of business where he welcomed callers at all hours of the day, hoping to do favors for citizens to win their goodwill and place them in his debt for future campaigns. During the evening, the home would be a venue for dinner parties with other elites, where philosophy was discussed, marriages were brokered, and political alliances were born. The Romans had a remarkably different understanding of the individual need for privacy that is so central to how we conceive of life today, and this is exemplified through an anecdote involving a young Roman with grand political ambitions, who, when building his house on the Palatine Hill, instructed the architect to design it so that as much of the home as possible was open to public view from passers-by. He wanted citizens of all sorts to come calling, but he also wanted them to know that as an aspiring politician, he had no secrets to keep. That young man was Marcus Livius Drusus, scion of a noble plebeian line, and someone who, like many of his peers, seemed to believe that it was his destiny to cure the Republic's ills and become the most prominent man in Rome. But despite his foresight, talent, and political acumen, Drusus's story would end in tragedy, not just for him, but for all of Italy. For his tireless advocacy on behalf of rural Italians would mark him out for assassination, and as he joined the ranks of the Gracchi, Saturninus, and Glaucia as yet another reformist martyr, his death would be met with more than simply the wails of his family and the mourning of his supporters. Instead of funeral dirges for just one man, all of Italy would be plunged into a conflict that cost an estimated 300,000 lives. This was the Social War, the first civil war of the Roman Republic, and a conflict which highlighted the failure of politics to secure needed reforms and set a precedent for war as a useful alternative to the ballot box. This was the first time that legion fought legion, but it would not be the last. Taking place from 91 to 88 BCE, the Social War pitted Rome against its Italian allies over the key issues of what it meant to be a Roman. After centuries of fighting by Rome's side, her Italian allies felt they were entitled to legal protection, political representation, and a greater share in the spoils and glory that came with military conquest. As the Republic's empire expanded across the Mediterranean, military service had become more of a burden, and the allies who bled alongside the Romans had silently borne the indignity of watching Rome accumulate the bulk of the spoils of these wars. This had accelerated the already unequal distribution of wealth across Italy, and the continued obstinance of Rome's political leaders made redress through political means impossible. Caius Gracchus had been the most prominent reformer to take up the Italian cause, but his Optimate rivals had expertly used his campaigning for the exploited allies as a wedge to separate him from his popular base. This was possible because under Roman voting arrangements, the absolute number of votes counted for nothing, as the electorate was divided into wealth classes or tribal affiliations that voted in blocks. It was a majority of these units which had to be won by candidates, and because of how unevenly distributed voters could be inside each block, there was no correlation between the popular vote and the actual outcome. So, to a poor Roman voter, the addition of poor Italian farmers into their tribes or census-based voting units would actually dilute the power of their vote instead of allowing them to build a broader, class-based electoral coalition. As such, the plebeians were unwilling to back a proposal that undercut them at the individual level, even if they recognized the justice of the cause. Tasked with undermining Gracchus was his fellow tribune, Marcus Livius Drusus. not the man we encountered earlier, but actually his father. It is a deep irony that the Drusus who would die for the Italian cause was the son of a man that had helped derail the most comprehensive legislative effort to provide Italians with the rights that would have averted the crisis. For Drusus the Elder's efforts would be so successful that Gracchus became isolated politically, and his movement was violently repressed in 121, resulting in the deaths of some 3,000 Romans. In the ensuing decades, no one was able to successfully convince the Senate or popular assemblies of the need to extend the franchise or legal protections to the Italian communities that now sometimes composed up to 2/3 of the Roman army. Those with the greatest vested interest in these proposals were also the ones who, by definition, had no political recourse or civic rights to press their claims. The Italians then stewed for a generation and grew more bitter as their grievances continued to fester. But they were not alone in their discontentment with the current political order. Like the Italian question, the key issues raised by the Gracchi largely remained unresolved, and it was becoming clear that Rome's political system was incapable of delivering the reforms that the equestrians, smallholding farmers, and the urban poor demanded. Given the heightening factionalism and political deadlock, it is little wonder that the Italians received short shrift. How could the concerns of non-voters possibly rise above the din of complaints being raised every day in the Forum? Rome required a political visionary, but given what had happened to the Gracchi in 131 and 121, and Saturninus in 100, it is little wonder that volunteers were in short supply.
If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support.
Into this void stepped the aforementioned Drusus the Younger, who won the Tribunate 491, campaigning on a bold slate of reforms that he believed could repair the growing rift at the heart of the Republic. But though he offered a dynamic political program, he had learned from the failures of the Gracchi, and won the backing of several of Rome's most prominent aristocrats for these proposals. Drusus was careful not to be interpreted as a radical by the elite. Instead of promising class conflict, he called for compromise and conciliation between the orders, hoping that by achieving consensus, he could bring about lasting change. So instead of offering benefits to just one segment of Roman society, he sought to win over all voters, first by restoring to the Senate the exclusive rights to serve as jurors, meaning that they would take over the corruption courts from the equestrians. But as compensation to Rome's business class, Drusus proposed doubling the size of the Senate and making 300 equestrians into senators, giving them instant eligibility to stand for the highest offices in Rome, and letting those who had achieved this new rank retain their status as jurors. To win over the poor, he sought to enhance the grain dole introduced by Gaius Gracchus, and also offered the promise of land redistribution to veterans and urban poor through the establishment of new Roman colonies. Though not part of his initial legislation, later he proposed granting the franchise and associated legal rights to all of Italy south of the Po River. In seeking to heal the divide between Senate and the equestrians, while also improving the lives of the urban poor and rewarding Italy for its continued loyalty, every single one of these proposals was an attempt to address the critical problems plaguing Rome through an even-handed, measured approach that offered something to everyone. But if the sign of a good compromise is that no one is truly happy with the outcome, then Drusus's moderate agenda was too well reasoned for its own good, for instead of bringing Romans closer together, the limited scope of his solutions left him in a difficult position. because the elite still refused any measures that would grant power or privilege to the lower orders. In addition, they objected to doubling the size of the Senate, as this was simply unprecedented. The Senate had long been set at roughly 300 members, so the addition of another 300 was seen as diluting the prestige of this august body. Senators did not sense that this was an appropriate reflection of the republic's greater size and complexity, or that it could fold the wealthiest equestrians into their power block, and thus strengthen the oligarchy in the long term. Instead, they were worried about the increased competition for honors and offices that would result from the 300 more men who were now set to campaign for the highest magistracies. In the end, it was the misfortune of Drusus to find that the Senate gave more approval to the evil measures of his colleagues than to his own plans, however excellent, and that it spurned the dignity which he would confer it only to accept tamely the real slights leveled against it by the others, tolerating the mediocrity of his colleagues while it looked with jealous eyes upon his own distinction. Furthermore, equestrians were loath to give up their positions on juries. This was their greatest check on senatorial power, and the fact that 300 of their number would be added to the Senate was small compensation for the loss of this critical influence. We must remember that there were far more than 300 equestrians, so those outside the highest ranks of this order would gain nothing while losing a great deal. In addition, the fact that the poor did not receive all they had asked for prevented them from fully rallying to Drusus's banner, as they had for more radical reformers. This prevented Drusus from building a sweeping coalition despite his support from prominent aristocrats, and so opposition to this legislation coalesced around Consul Lucius Marcius Philippus and Praetor Servius Capio. What followed was the greatest escalation of domestic political violence that Rome had seen since the deposition of Saturninus a decade earlier. The day for the promulgation of the bills was at hand, when, on a sudden, so vast a multitude appeared on all sides that the city seemed to be beset by a hostile force. Philippus the consul, nevertheless, ventured to oppose the bills, but the tribune's attendant seized him by the throat and did not let go until blood poured into his mouth and eyes. Thus the bills were brought forward and passed by violence. When passage of Drusus's bills had seemed assured, the opposition objected on grounds that Philippus, as augur, had observed inauspicious omens, heralding divine displeasure with the laws. Seeing this for the ruse that it was, the reformers had steamrolled past this constitutional hurdle and proceeded with the vote. However, given the contentious nature of their passage, Philippus soon called for the laws to be annulled, and, during a debate on this in the Senate, Drusus's ally, Lucius Licinius Crassus, gave such an impassioned defense of the reforms that he fell ill and died a week later. This seemed to confirm the suspicions of the superstitious Romans that the laws were passed contrary to divine will, and Philippus succeeded in having the laws abrogated. With Crassus dead, and his accomplishments rendered null and void, Drusus needed new allies, and openly embraced the non-citizen Italians, promising to secure the franchise for them. This seemed like a curious tactic, as what was the use of non-voters in a political coalition? We don't know for sure, as it is difficult to separate fact from fiction in our biased sources here, but perhaps Drusus realized that though the Italians couldn't vote, an Italian could intimidate a political opponent in the forum just as effectively as a Roman citizen, and we are told that Drusus's Italian ally Quintus Pompedius Silo marched on Rome with 10,000 of his countrymen as a show of their strength and desire to be included in the Roman civic community. Still, despite the justness of their cause and the long-term benefits it would offer the Republic, There was no political desire from any segment of Roman society to add Italians to the voting rolls. Elites were still reluctant to compete for command positions with the Italian nobility, and the poor chafed at the idea of their political influence diminishing in a wave of new Italian voters. Furthermore, the peculiar system of clientship and patronage served as another key block on the proposal, because any man that led a successful effort to win the vote for the Italians would place them in his political debt, transforming him into the most powerful figure in the Republic overnight. The Senate had no desire to cede that much influence to one man, and continued to drag its feet, even though it meant straining relations with the Italians who had helped make the Republic's military success possible. Drusus refused to drop the issue and associated ever closer with the leaders of the Italian cause. As the efforts continued to make no headway, the patience of the Italians was wearing thin, and Drusus himself relayed that there was even a plot to assassinate the consuls. This may have been the truth, or perhaps simply a bid to show the urgency of the situation, but Drusus failed to account for the natural follow-up question. If there was an Italian conspiracy to assassinate the consuls, how did he know about it? His moderate reforms stymied by the Senate, and his advocacy for the Italians earning him the disdain of rich and poor alike, Drusus was isolated and soon fell victim to assassination himself. Returning from the forum surrounded by the large and unorganized crowd which always attended him, he was stabbed in the area before his house and died in a few hours, the assassin leaving the weapon in his side. As he breathed his last and gazed at the throng of those who stood weeping about him, he uttered the words, most expressive of his own feelings. "O my relatives and friends, will my country ever have another citizen like me?" This inglorious end for their champion caused the Italians to realize that politics offered no respite from their lower status within the Roman order. Shortly after his death, half of Italy was in revolt, and the deadly war was only ended after Rome offered the very rights and privileges that the Italians had long demanded. This success seemed then to validate an approach to politics that viewed armed force as a legitimate political tactic when other methods failed. It is a message that was understood well by a rising generation of young Romans that included Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. For if we are to see Drusus as a man who believed in using incremental change and moderation to build consensus that spanned Roman social divides, then his dying lament would prove prophetic. Rome would never again have a citizen like him, and the civil war he sought to avoid was the harbinger of other conflicts pitting Roman against Roman until the Republic itself was no more.